The rich passenger stood up in first class, pointed directly at the black pilot entering the cabin, and shouted, "I'm not flying with him!" The entire airplane went silent instantly. Flight attendants froze beside the aisle. Passengers slowly turned their heads. Phones started coming out. And while dozens of travelers watched the elderly black pilot get publicly humiliated before takeoff, nobody inside the aircraft realized the next 20 minutes would leave that same woman begging him to land the plane safely. Before we begin, comment your city and what time it is right now, because this story starts 30,000 feet above the ground with arrogance, humiliation, and fear trapped inside a luxury aircraft. But what happens next changes the atmosphere of the entire flight forever. It happened on a crowded evening flight from New York to Los Angeles. Business travelers filled first class. Champagne glasses rested beside leather seats. Expensive watches flashed beneath cabin lights. And when Captain Marcus Hill quietly walked through the aisle wearing his pilot uniform, one wealthy passenger decided she already knew exactly what kind of pilot he must be. The luxury aircraft glowed beneath soft, golden cabin lighting, while passengers settled into oversized leather first-class seats surrounded by quiet conversations, champagne glasses, and the constant low hum of boarding announcements overhead. Flight attendants moved smoothly through the aisle, helping wealthy travelers store luggage inside overhead bins, while business executives checked emails and older couples adjusted blankets near the windows. Everything inside the aircraft projected comfort, status, and control. Near seat 2, sat Victoria Langford, mid-50s, expensive jewelry, designer coat folded carefully beside her seat. The kind of woman who carried entitlement naturally without needing to announce it directly. Victoria glanced impatiently toward the boarding door while tapping polished nails against the armrest. She hated delays, hated discomfort, hated feeling uncertain in places where she expected perfection. Across the aisle, another passenger quietly whispered, "That's Victoria Langford, real estate investor." Her reputation carried the same energy she did, demanding, loud when displeased, used to being accommodated instantly. Several rows behind first class, the final passengers boarded while flight attendants prepared the cabin for departure. Then suddenly the front galley curtain opened. Captain Marcus Hill stepped into the aisle, calmly greeting passengers before takeoff. Tall, early 60s, dark pilot uniform perfectly pressed. Gray hair near the edges of his cap. Calm, disciplined posture shaped by decades inside military cockpits and commercial aircraft. Marcus moved with quiet confidence that experienced pilots often carried naturally. The moment Victoria looked up and saw him approaching down the aisle, her expression changed immediately. Her polite boredom hardened into visible discomfort. Marcus smiled politely toward nearby passengers while continuing his pre-flight walkthrough. "Good evening, everyone." Several passengers nodded warmly back, but Victoria kept staring at him intensely. Her eyes moved slowly across his face, his uniform, his captain's stripes. Then finally she muttered quietly beneath her breath, "Oh no." The businessman beside her frowned slightly. "Excuse me?" Victoria kept staring toward Marcus. "That's the pilot?" The sentence carried disbelief heavy enough for nearby passengers to hear immediately. Captain Hill continued calmly through the aisle, unaware the atmosphere behind him had already started changing. Victoria suddenly unbuckled her seatbelt sharply and stood up in the middle of first class beneath the attention of nearby passengers. "Excuse me," she called loudly toward a flight attendant. The attendant turned immediately. "Yes, ma'am?" Victoria pointed directly toward Marcus, now standing near the cockpit entrance. "Is he flying this plane?" The question cut through the cabin instantly. Conversation stopped. Several passengers looked up from phones and laptops while flight attendants visibly stiffened near the galley. Marcus turned slowly after hearing the commotion behind him. The flight attendant answered carefully. "Yes, ma'am, that's Captain Hill." Victoria laughed once. Short, cold, disbelieving. "Absolutely not." Complete silence spread through first class. Marcus remained calm near the cockpit while the embarrassment settled heavily across the cabin around him. "Ma'am," the attendant started carefully. Victoria interrupted loudly. "I paid for first class. I am not trusting my life to some diversity hire pilot." Gasps spread immediately across several rows. One younger passenger visibly lowered his headphones, while another slowly reached for his phone beneath the seat. Marcus stood completely still now, not angry, not defensive, just watching her quietly. Somehow that calmness made the scene feel even heavier. The flight attendant's face flushed immediately. "Ma'am, Captain Hill is one of our most experienced pilots." Victoria crossed her arms aggressively. "Then where's the real captain?" Silence crashed across the aircraft. Nearby passengers exchanged stunned looks, while even the businessmen across the aisle now looked uncomfortable. Marcus finally stepped slightly closer. "Good evening, ma'am," he said calmly. "I am the captain." Victoria looked him directly in the eyes now. "That's exactly the problem." The humiliation spread through first class instantly. Public, loud, inescapable. Several passengers openly stared now while phones quietly started recording from different seats. Marcus stood there in full uniform while a wealthy passenger questioned his competence in front of an entire aircraft before takeoff even began. The emotional atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted completely after Victoria's outburst. Earlier, the cabin carried the calm, polished energy of luxury travel. Now tension spread row by row beneath the soft cabin lights while passengers whispered quietly and flight attendants exchanged nervous glances near the galley. Captain Hill remained composed, despite the humiliation unfolding publicly around him. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "if you're uncomfortable, customer service can assist after landing." Victoria shook her head immediately. "No!" She pointed directly toward him again. "You should be removed." Several passengers visibly reacted hearing that. A younger woman near the window muttered quietly, "Oh my God," beneath her breath while another traveler openly started recording now without hiding it anymore. The senior flight attendant finally stepped between them carefully. "Ms. Langford, Captain Hill has over 30 years of experience." Victoria laughed sarcastically. "Doing what?" Silence again. Deep, uncomfortable silence. Marcus kept his expression controlled, but inside the aircraft more passengers were now watching him than the woman humiliating him. That familiar social instinct, people studying the target instead of the behavior itself. Marcus finally answered quietly, "Flying aircraft safely." The sentence landed calmly, professionally, but Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically. "Wonderful." She grabbed her purse sharply. "Then I want another flight." The attendant hesitated. "Ma'am, boarding is complete." Victoria stepped into the aisle now, making the situation even larger publicly. "Then delay the plane." Groans spread softly from farther back in first class. One businessman finally spoke up quietly. "Ma'am, this is ridiculous." Victoria snapped toward him instantly. "Would you let somebody inexperienced fly your family?" Marcus lowered his eyes briefly after hearing that word. Inexperienced. Because deep down, he already knew this confrontation had nothing to do with aviation. The attendant quietly touched her earpiece now while trying to de-escalate the situation. Meanwhile, outside the aircraft windows, rain clouds slowly gathered over the runway in the distance, unnoticed by almost everyone inside the cabin. After nearly 15 uncomfortable minutes of delay, airport supervisors finally convinced Victoria to remain on board after privately reassuring her about Captain Hill's qualifications. But the emotional damage inside the cabin lingered heavily now. Passengers continued whispering while phones occasionally pointed subtly toward first class, where Victoria sat rigidly near the aisle with visible irritation still covering her face. Captain Hill returned quietly to the cockpit without another public word. That somehow unsettled several passengers more than anger would have, because his silence carried experience, discipline, the kind developed after surviving humiliation before. The aircraft finally pushed back from the gate beneath darkening skies, while cabin lights dimmed softly for departure. Rain tapped lightly against the windows now as the engines roared louder beneath the massive aircraft. Flight attendants secured carts and prepared the cabin while passengers fastened seatbelts. Victoria stared coldly toward the cockpit door the entire time. "Unbelievable," she muttered again beneath her breath. Beside her, the businessman finally replied quietly, "You should stop talking." Victoria ignored him completely. Moments later, the plane accelerated down the rain-covered runway beneath powerful engine noise before lifting smoothly into the dark evening sky. At first, the climb felt normal, stable, calm. But 20 minutes into the flight, everything changed. Without warning, the aircraft suddenly dropped violently beneath a massive pocket of turbulence. Gasps exploded throughout the cabin. Overhead compartments rattled loudly while drinks spilled across tray tables. Another violent shake slammed through the plane immediately afterward. Screams erupted farther back in economy. The seatbelt signs flashed urgently overhead while lightning illuminated dark storm clouds outside the windows. Victoria's face lost color instantly. The aircraft dropped again sharply. People grabbed armrests. A child started crying loudly behind first class. Then Captain Hill's voice came calmly across the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hill. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are navigating severe weather ahead." His voice remained perfectly steady despite the chaos around them. Professional, controlled, calm under pressure. And for the first time since boarding the aircraft, Victoria looked afraid instead of angry. The turbulence intensified violently over the next several minutes. Lightning flashed repeatedly outside the windows, while the aircraft shook hard enough to send terrified screams through sections of the cabin. Flight attendants strapped themselves into jump seats, while passengers gripped armrests and prayed quietly beneath the constant rattling of the storm around them. Victoria clutched both sides of her seat now with pale knuckles and trembling hands. Earlier arrogance had vanished completely from her face. Every violent shake pushed pure fear deeper into the cabin. Another sudden drop sent several passengers crying out loudly. Glass shattered somewhere behind first class. Oxygen masks almost released from one overhead panel before stabilizing again. Then, once more. Captain Hill's voice calmly filled the aircraft. "Cabin crew remain seated. We'll be clear shortly." The calmness in his voice spread through the cabin differently now. Reassuring, grounding, experienced. Passengers listened to him the way frightened people listen to someone carrying real control during chaos. The businessman beside Victoria finally looked toward her quietly. "Sounds like he knows exactly what he's doing." Victoria said nothing, because now every passenger inside the aircraft understood something deeply uncomfortable. The pilot she publicly humiliated moments earlier was the same man now carrying hundreds of terrified people safely through a violent storm 30,000 feet above the ground. The aircraft shook again brutally beneath thunderclouds while Captain Hill continued guiding the plane calmly through turbulence invisible to everyone else on board. Invisible, except him. After nearly 20 terrifying minutes, the turbulence slowly began easing while passengers throughout the aircraft remained emotionally exhausted beneath dim cabin lighting. Some people cried quietly. Others sat frozen, staring out dark windows still flashing occasionally with distant lightning. Then Captain Hill's voice returned across the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now clear of the storm system." Relief spread visibly through the cabin. Several passengers even applauded softly. But Captain Hill continued speaking. "For those wondering, this weather pattern developed unexpectedly faster than predicted." He paused briefly. "Fortunately," another small pause, "I spent 12 years flying military rescue missions through conditions far worse than this." Silence spread across first class instantly. Victoria slowly looked toward the cockpit door now with completely different eyes. Captain Hill continued calmly. "Your safety remains my responsibility. Thank you for your patience." The intercom clicked off. One older passenger whispered quietly, "Military pilot," while another shook his head slowly. The businessman beside Victoria leaned back calmly. "Guess you found the real captain after all." Victoria stared forward speechlessly now, while shame slowly replaced the panic still visible on her face. Nearly 2 hours later, the aircraft descended smoothly through calm Los Angeles night skies beneath glowing city lights stretching endlessly below the cabin windows. But the emotional atmosphere on board remained completely different from departure. Earlier passengers watched Captain Hill through suspicion, fueled by one woman's public humiliation. Now the cabin carried quiet respect. The aircraft touched down perfectly beneath soft applause, spreading throughout multiple sections of the plane. Several passengers actually clapped louder once the wheels safely reached the runway. Flight attendants smiled emotionally toward each other, while people visibly relaxed for the first time since the storm began. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Victoria remained completely silent beside the aisle. No arrogance left, no complaints, only visible discomfort sitting heavily across her expression. When the aircraft finally parked and passengers slowly began standing to retrieve luggage, Captain Hill unexpectedly stepped briefly out of the cockpit near first class. Several passengers thanked him immediately. "Amazing job, Captain. Thank you for getting us through that. Incredible flying!" Marcus thanked them politely one by one. Then his eyes briefly met Victoria's. She looked away immediately. Most passengers had already exited when Victoria finally stood slowly near the front galley, clutching her purse awkwardly against her side. Captain Hill remained speaking quietly with the flight crew near the cockpit door, while airport lights reflected softly across the emptying cabin. Victoria hesitated several seconds before approaching him. "Captain Hill?" Marcus turned calmly. "Yes, ma'am?" For the first time during the entire flight, Victoria looked uncertain, human, small. She struggled visibly now. "I owe you an apology." Marcus said nothing yet. Victoria swallowed hard. "What I said earlier," her eyes lowered briefly, "it was wrong." The silence between them lasted several long seconds. Finally, Marcus answered quietly, "Yes, it was." The honesty hit harder than anger would have. Victoria nodded slowly while emotion and embarrassment collided visibly across her face. "You saved all of us tonight." Marcus studied her calmly before replying, "No, ma'am." He glanced briefly toward the cockpit behind him. "I simply did my job." Another painful silence followed, because deep down, both of them understood the larger truth hanging beneath the conversation. She trusted him only after fear forced her to. Long after passengers exited into the airport terminal, Captain Marcus Hill remained briefly alone inside the quiet aircraft cockpit beneath dim instrument lights glowing softly across polished controls. Rain still moved lightly across the windows outside, while distant airport vehicles crossed the runway below. Marcus removed his captain's hat slowly before staring out across the dark airfield in silence. The humiliation from earlier still lingered somewhere inside him, not because it surprised him, because it didn't. Meanwhile, inside the terminal, videos recorded during the confrontation already spread online beneath headlines criticizing the passengers' behavior aboard the flight. But the part people discussed most wasn't the turbulence, or the apology. It was the contrast between panic and prejudice, how quickly fear changed people once survival depended on the very person they publicly doubted. As Marcus finally exited the aircraft carrying his flight bag through the quiet terminal hallway, one young flight attendant caught up beside him. "Captain?" Marcus looked over. She smiled softly. "You handled today with more grace than most people could." Marcus gave a tired little smile. "Flying through storms is usually easier than flying through people." The attendant laughed quietly. Then both continued walking beneath the bright terminal lights, while somewhere behind them, one wealthy passenger sat alone, finally confronting an uncomfortable truth. Confidence is easy when life feels safe. Character is revealed when fear forces you to trust the very people you believed never belonged in control at all.